making sure an incident like this doesn't happen again, and making sure that the Aurora Police Department is able to maintain the confidence of the people of Aurora going forward. Critical mistakes, let me just dive right into a quick summary of this, and I want to be sure that we leave time for any questions that the council members may have regarding any part of the report. Obviously, I'm not going to cover every detail. It's about a 30-plus page factual report, but I think we can get into some of the most important issues here without any problem. We concluded that critical mistakes were made in the Aurora Police Department's response. First, in the immediate response to the incident on the day of the incident, that is March 29th, 2019. Secondly, in reviewing the Aurora Police Department's own response to the incident. And third, in the final outcome of the disciplinary process related to Officer Meyer. I want to emphasize, however, that we also have concluded that the evidence was not sufficient to establish that these acts and failures to act were the result of any improper motive, that they were done with an intent to obstruct justice or done in bad faith. To the contrary, we conclude that they reflect failures of judgment, serious errors in decision-making, and ultimately note that members of the Aurora Police Department themselves criticized these decisions as being a failure of leadership. Now, all of these failures of judgment ultimately altered the course of the response to the incident and led to a situation where, in effect, it was not possible to proceed with what, in retrospect, would have been a valid criminal prosecution. It also delayed the initiation of an internal affairs investigation into the event, and had the effect ultimately, as I think everyone in this room knows, of creating a controversy that undermined the public's confidence in the Aurora Police Department. But I do want to emphasize a really notable fact, and that is at every moment during the course of this event, of this response, there were Aurora police officers who were concerned about the adequacy of the police department's response and were advocating a different approach. There's a situation here where we have line officers and supervisory officers who are trying to approach this in a way that, had their advice and their counsel been followed, would have resulted in a very different set of outcomes. So just to touch base with you all on facts that I'm sure you know. On Friday afternoon, March 29th of this past year, Officer Meyer was found unconscious in his stopped car in an active traffic lane on East Mississippi near the south gate of the Buckley Air Force Base. The motor was running, the car was in gear, but fortunately his foot was on the brake. It was later determined that he was unconscious because of really what has to be characterized as extreme alcohol intoxication. By coincidence, then Deputy Chief O'Keefe was driving not too far from this location and was in fact the first officer to arrive at the scene. APD's response to that scene was appropriate as a response to an officer in distress, but it was materially lacking and incomplete as a response to a traffic incident and potential officer misconduct. Now, I want to emphasize this as well. The exact nature of Officer Meyer's medical condition was confusing and unclear that afternoon. And while Chief O'Keefe smelled alcohol and two other officers did as well, the paramedics who responded did not interpret the circumstances to be intoxication. There was a genuine question on the ground as to whether or not Officer Meyer was suffering some other kind of medical incident, and that particularly on scene created a certain amount of confusion. Nevertheless, at the hospital, that situation became more clear and should have led to a different set of steps being taken. Chief O'Keefe was the ranking officer present, and as a result, he was in charge. And he made decisions that resulted in APD failing to take reasonable investigative steps and gather all the information that was actually available, and that would have made it possible to pursue a criminal investigation and also an internal affairs investigation. Now, Chief O'Keefe has indicated that he did not believe that there was sufficient evidence to establish reasonable suspicion, the legal term, to continue an investigation. However, I would note, and our report concludes, that in making that decision, Chief O'Keefe made a number of mistakes. First of all, he failed to credit his own observation and smell of alcohol when he entered the car to assist Officer Meyer. That, in combination with the circumstances of the stop, per APD policy, was enough to constitute reasonable suspicion. In addition to that, he did not take those additional investigative steps because he was focused on responding to the incident as an officer in distress situation. Now, that was laudable, it was appropriate, but it did not exclude taking the necessary steps to investigate the possibility of officer misconduct. Let me give you a few examples of things that Chief O'Keefe did not do that he should have done. He did not huddle all of the responding officers to collect their observations and to determine what the state of the evidence was. Had he done that, he would have learned the two other officers also smelled alcohol, the two other officers who went into the car to assist the officer who was intoxicated. Secondly, he did not ask a responding traffic officer at the hospital to go in and observe Officer Meyer to determine whether or not there were other indicia of intoxication. That traffic officer believes that if she had had the opportunity to do that, she would have developed evidence sufficient to proceed with the rest of the investigation. He did not make a preservation request to the hospital for any blood samples in case it became necessary to test them later. And he did not take into account the fact that medical staff, which basically started to refuse to provide information to the responding officers, which is kind of a unique situation, frankly, in this context, that fact at least raised yellow flags as to what was going on, particularly, and this is important, particularly when coupled with the fact that the medical personnel were also saying that the officer was fine, it would go home in a couple of hours. And finally, although many officers reported that Chief O'Keefe was in fact wrestling with the question of reasonable suspicion, Chief O'Keefe did not reach out to the DA's office to ask for legal advice on the strength of the evidence and what steps might be possibly taken from that point. Now, Chief O'Keefe, I think, was candid in his interviews with the internal affairs investigators in indicating that his thought was he wanted to protect an Aurora police officer who might be suffering a medical incident from being subjected to blood draws in criminal investigations. However, the reality was there was enough information on the ground, and there was enough information available to Chief O'Keefe, had he reached out to get it, that would have established that there was reason to continue. The two things are not inconsistent. It's possibly very concerned, and appropriately so, for the wellness of an officer, and at the same time take necessary steps to investigate the possibility of misconduct. As a result, he made the mistake, the error in judgment, and I think ultimately, as I've indicated, what several Aurora Police Department officers have indicated was a failure of leadership of calling off the criminal investigation that night and also the internal affairs investigation. Now, so that was the first error in this response, and a significant one. That was a Friday afternoon into the evening. On the following Monday morning, 3 different supervisory Aurora police officers reviewed the incident reports from Friday and also reviewed the body-worn cameras of the responding officers. And those supervisory officers quickly concluded that there had been enough information to establish reasonable suspicion to continue an investigation. They went to Chief O'Keefe, presented that information. Chief O'Keefe was surprised to learn that 2 other officers had also smelled alcohol. And everyone immediately realized that an internal affairs investigation was necessary. Chief O'Keefe appropriately recused because he had been involved in the response, and that investigation began. 2 officers went to Chief Metz and asked, suggested, recommended that the scope of the internal affairs investigation include the response of Chief O'Keefe. In other words, not just the intoxicated officer, but also whether or not the decisions that were made on Friday night were appropriate. And Chief Metz declined to expand the scope of the internal affairs investigation. He had other mechanisms as well to evaluate the performance of Chief O'Keefe, including a performance review under policies of the department, and he chose not to do those, to exercise those other mechanisms either. That was, we believe, the second error that was made, in that there was an opportunity for the department to take a hard look on the response on that Friday night, and it was not done. Now, the internal affairs investigation that ensued was done in a thorough and complete way. We have no criticisms of the way that that investigation was conducted. In fact, it resulted in a recommendation that there be 4 violations of policy found, and ultimately, those conclusions were presented to the Chief's Review Board, which is the ultimate recommending body to the chief on discipline. The Chief's Review Board, evaluating that evidence, recommended to Chief Metz that the officer be terminated, and gave 5 reasons for that. First, the officer's excessive blood alcohol level. Second, that the officer, while on duty, went home during the day, consumed more alcohol. While consuming alcohol, put on his uniform and service weapon, got back into his Aurora Police Department vehicle, and drove quite a considerable distance back to where he was ultimately located unconscious. And obviously the 5th reason being that he did drive back that distance. It was probably about a half an hour drive. Fortunately, there was no traffic incident involving anyone else. Now, ultimately, Chief Metz chose not to terminate the officer, but instead to demote him, impose other conditions, including a 260-hour suspension. That decision was within the chief's legal authority, which is quite broad, and it was reviewed and approved by the city manager's office. Nevertheless, our review and our report concludes that Chief Metz's decision failed to take into account the totality of the circumstances surrounding this incident, particularly given the severity of the conduct that we're talking about here. And he also failed to take into account the public impact of an incident of this kind. That's not only for the 5 reasons that the Chief's Review Board gave, but in addition to the fact that the blood alcohol level of this officer was so high, and there was undisputed evidence of a sort of ongoing years-long alcohol abuse problem, that really the only reasonable conclusion in our view is that this was unlikely to have been the first time that he was intoxicated on duty. All of those things lead us to the conclusion, as you'll see in the report, that Chief Metz's decision, while appropriately focused on giving an officer a second chance and looking out for the wellness of officers, a completely laudable goal, failed to take into account the broader impact of a decision not to terminate under circumstances of this kind. As I've already said, although that was the 3rd of the 3 mistakes, errors in judgment that we believe took place. As I've already said, the evidence from our review does not establish that this was done out of any bad motive, an intent to obstruct justice, but nevertheless, these were significant failures of judgment, significant failures in decision-making, and also, frankly, as officers have indicated to us, a failure of leadership. Now, those are our conclusions in sum, and there's a great deal of factual detail in the report, as you may have already seen. We make 6 recommendations. I want to focus on the 4 that are most devoted to ensuring that in the future, all investigations of potential misconduct by Aurora police officers are done in a completely independent and neutral way. These are, I think, fairly straightforward recommendations and fall into the category of common sense. First of all, required criminal investigations. In response to this incident, already the Aurora Police Department has modified its policies to require and a criminal investigation be initiated when there is reasonable suspicion to believe that an officer has been intoxicated and either is driving a car, has recently driven a car, or is in the possession of a firearm. We think that's an entirely appropriate change, should be implemented, and that officers should be trained on it. Secondly, in cases in which there is a reason to believe, and that's intentionally a lower standard than that reasonable suspicion standard that exists under the law. When there is a reason to believe that an APD officer might have been intoxicated in those three circumstances, the responding officers should always contact the DA's office for advice on how to proceed. And that's particularly true if an officer is considering deciding not to investigate further. We believe that had there been a consultation with the DA's office in this instance on that night of March 29th, that this incident would have gone in a very different direction. Third, as a best practice, we believe that the Aurora Police Department, in any case where there is the potential for serious misconduct by an APD member, should consider referring the case to a third-party law enforcement agency for investigation, taking into account practicality and also taking into account the totality of the circumstances. Why do I say those last two things? There may be times when getting another responding agency to be there in time to deal with the situation is simply not possible. Nevertheless, it's the kind of situation that should be at the top of the list of any responding officer and any supervisory officer and the chief to consider to ensure that there's complete neutrality and to win the confidence of the community that Aurora PD has policies in place that will enable even misconduct by its own to be investigated fully. Fourth, we recommend that there be increased use of independent review boards. And I believe that the city manager was touching on this a moment ago. It's important that everyone understand what I mean when I say independent review board. What we're talking about in this context is the existing mechanism within the APD disciplinary process where the chief or an officer who's subject to discipline can essentially ask for a community independent review board for a review of potential discipline. The independent review board is equally composed of citizen members and members of the Aurora Police Department, and they ultimately serve as an additional recommending group to the chief to make recommendations on discipline. We recommend that in any case in which there is the potential or an allegation of serious misconduct by an officer, that the chief consider implementing an independent review board. We believe that that is a way to foster transparency and confidence that the discipline process itself is going to be adequate to the severity of, or the lack of severity of the event or the violation that's in question. Now, we have two other recommendations that are more technical in nature, and I'm just going to mention them, and I'm happy to answer questions about them. First of all, we do think it's important that there be a clean line separating officers who are responding in a peer support capacity to an officer in distress and investigating officers. We had a situation here where an officer was put in the difficult position of being both on a trauma response team and being summoned to the scene in that capacity, but also being on duty as part of the patrol chain of command that afternoon. She was put in the position of having to decide, how do I reconcile these two things? Our recommendation is there be a policy that clearly indicates that an officer faced with that conundrum simply says, I'm here either as investigating officer or I'm here in a peer support capacity. And I want to emphasize that is no criticism of that officer who was literally summoned in two different ways to the same scene. And then finally, we have a couple of clarifications of policy regarding the consequences for officer DUIs, basically that an arrest is not necessary, and also specifically including a reference to a high blood alcohol content reading as an aggravating factor. So those are our findings and conclusions. Those are our recommendations. I want to emphasize a couple of things here. At the end of the day, in this incident, we had a highly intoxicated Aurora police officer who was driving on duty while armed in an Aurora Police Department car. Ultimately, he was not fully investigated on the criminal side, and he was not charged. He was also not terminated. That combination of facts presents a serious problem. A civilian simply would not have been given this same lenient treatment, and shouldn't be. Neither should a police officer. Our recommendations ultimately are designed to make an incident of this kind impossible to reoccur, and also to help the new chief and the Aurora Police Department reestablish and further confirm its credibility in the community. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. In the interest of time, because we have a hard stop at 1:30, we can just all keep that in mind with our questions, and maybe with you for your answers. One of the things that came up earlier is that some of the information that we're probably going to ask for are questions, or maybe not things that you can provide back immediately.
Sure.
I think some of mine would probably require looking back at notes or whatnot, and so if that's something that, would be something that you can send back because you don't have that readily available, you can just do that. That's fine too.
Of course.
Because I think we're going to have a lot of questions. I won't speak for everyone. The report is really good, so thank you for the report, but I think that everything in it has confirmed the worst suspicions that at least I had of how this was going to play out, so I'm very frustrated by the findings and the outcome, because maybe a small part of me was hoping it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, and it is, so that's a little disappointing. So I won't speak for everyone. I'll let everyone else ask their questions first, and then I do have a few at the end, but I have a hunch that some of them are going to be redundant. So we will start with committee members, and then we'll go around the room. And also our mayor has joined us. I didn't want to interrupt and do that in the middle of the presentation, so we can start there. So, Jordan?
Yeah, thank you very much for preparing this report. I got a chance to review it before we met and have formulated some questions. One specifically that I want to ask, though, is it's disappointing to me that it appears like the rank and file of our police department is having to pay because of poor choice of a few, probably two people at the highest level of the Aurora Police Department, because we have 700 plus officers who do a great job. So my question is, you made the comment that there isn't evidence to support bad motives. What evidence would you need to support that? Because it appears to me like we had two senior people who made the decision to ignore their observations one, to ignore their observations on the scene, and then secondly, to ignore feedback they received from other responding officers. So I guess my question is, and that might be a legal definition, I guess, but what would be an improper motive if that's not? Because it appears like they ignored the available information.
A couple of points that I think are important for the council to understand. First of all, as I said earlier, there was some genuine confusion as to what the medical situation was. In some ways, this was such an extreme outlier in terms of intoxication that multiple officers and multiple responding medical personnel indicated they had never seen a person present in this way while intoxicated. In other words, it came across like a stroke or some other, unfortunate medical situation. And Chief O'Keefe, in the course of his response, was candidly discussing and trying to evaluate whether this was, a freak medical incident. And so it isn't just Chief O'Keefe saying that he was concerned about that. We have multiple other officers saying that night at the hospital that was the discussion. What is the nature of this situation? Even if that had been the situation, though, our criticism is that Chief O'Keefe had the opportunity to collect more information and to engage in further investigation to establish whether or not a criminal investigation should continue. But that's very different than saying bad motive. He was legitimately concerned, we believe, about the health and safety of this officer. He just let that become too much of a focus, is our conclusion, rather than recognizing that you can be concerned about the wellness of an officer and also recognize there might be misconduct. So that's the basis for our conclusion here. We did not find direct evidence of an intention to take misconduct and sweep it under the rug. Let's just be direct about that.
This is probably a legal question. What constitutes reasonable suspicion?
Well, that's why it's always good to call
Your comment, the average citizen, I would think it would have been stated that there was reasonable suspicion to arrest them for DUI in this situation.
Well, it's an interesting thing, because it's one of those classic places in the criminal law where reasonable suspicion is outlined by case law and the individual decisions of judges rather. And in fact, there are policies of the Aurora Police Department outlining things that can constitute reasonable suspicion. One of them is you have a traffic incident involving some sort of erratic or unusual driving and the smell of alcohol. Aurora PD's policies already say that. In fact, we recently came across, we did some comparison of policies around the country as we wrote this report, and there are sheets sort of from various national police agencies or organizations saying, all right, here's a checklist of evidence constituting reasonable suspicion. So it varies depending on the crime, but this is what officers are trained to spot. One of our findings as well that I didn't mention is that, but which is in the report, is that Chief O'Keefe was the ranking officer and in charge. He should have let the investigators who do this work day in and day out run with the investigation and deferred to them and given them that ability, and that was a part of his mistake.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, thank you for this report, and I didn't read through all 300 pages.
Of course.
But I do have a question about, I know that it was under the discretion of Chief Metz to ultimately make the decision on this officer. But then there was a kind of a connection with the city manager's office. I guess my question is, could the city manager, and I'm not sure what information was provided, I don't know, but could they have overruled that decision of Chief Metz? I'm just trying to understand. It was an agreement with that decision, and I'm having a hard time with why that decision was met when to me it was wrong. I mean, and I guess I haven't read the whole report. Do you have something in there that talks a little bit about that?
Yes.
Does the chief override what if the city manager said or the city manager's office said, I don't think I agree with this?
So when the discipline is above a certain threshold level, the city charter actually provides that it has to be approved by the city manager's office. The city charter also indicates, though, that the city manager's office should be sure to give the chief the opportunity to run the department. And so there's no question but that the city manager's office could have essentially refused to approve, but that's the context in which this happened. And if you take a look at the report, there's a further discussion of that point.
Thank you. This is more of a comment, and that I appreciated that was in there. I'm disappointed with the series of events, but I do want to highlight that there were some officers that really did the right thing. Division Chief Ortiz, Commander Dudley, the IEB lieutenant went to leadership and, said, hey, we need to do this, we need to do that, this is what we think. And I think it's important to bring that up. We have an excellent police department, and we had people who stepped up and did the right thing by bringing those issues up. So I just wanted to comment on that.
And the report is completely consistent with that. I do also want to note two other things. First of all, I know there's been some controversy about body-worn cameras and how they were turned on or turned off or they weren't functioning. But I would note that the officers who have received some criticism for that, did include in their written incident reports the fact that there had been a smell of alcohol, the fact that there was the possibility of intoxication in their reports. That was sometimes because sergeants or lieutenants said, be sure to put that in the report, but it further confirms, I think, the point that you're making, Councilman. And the other point that I would make, and I want to be direct about this as well. Both Chief Metz and Chief O'Keefe have had long, distinguished law enforcement careers. Nothing in this report is intended to impugn any of that. This is a situation where we ultimately concluded that they made the wrong decisions in this specific incident.
So I have a couple of questions.
Yes, please.
Councilmember Gardner touched on one of them, on what's the difference between improper motives versus just poor judgment, because I was able to read through your 33 pages. I haven't read the full directives. But in it, there's a couple of things that are inconsistent. And we have, Deputy Chief O'Keefe saying that he didn't know that other people knew that there was a smell of alcohol, but another officer said that there was a head shake indicating it when they got into the car. We have, I think it was a CRB that wanted to investigate Deputy Chief O'Keefe's actions in terms of the investigation of alcohol, and our former police chief decided not to do that, and yet here's an entire report showing that that was not the right call. And when you combine that with the comment that's on the last page, I think, of the report, that our former chief didn't take into account community and public safety, it makes it difficult to suss out the differences between those two, because when you add that all up together, on both counts, it doesn't look good. And so I think is unfortunate is that the decisions that were made by a couple of people at the top have undermined the public trust in an entire department who doesn't deserve that treatment. And I have, not that I'm defending Nate Meyer's decision-making at all, but he clearly had an alcohol problem, and these decisions were made without his consent, and he was very forthcoming and transparent with everything after the fact, and went through all of the punishments that he gave, and he was given, and he was launched into international news and publicly shamed because we had people at the top who chose to do what they did. And I think they owe him an apology, because I don't think that that's helpful. And I don't know him personally, I've never spoken to him, but I hope he's, getting the support that he needs, because this was international news, and nobody deserves that, and that's squarely on the shoulders of the people who made these choices. But thank you for the report, even though I'm really frustrated with what's in it. So.
What we did with the report is lay out the facts, and like in any investigation I've ever done, they don't always line up 100% in one direction. It's just the nature of human beings and their recollection. We have given you our best judgment on what the facts show at the end of the day.
Oh, thank you. Any other comments?
No, I'm okay.
All right, thank you all. We're obviously happy to follow up if there are any questions after the fact that any members of council or the mayor might have regarding the contents of the report or our recommendations. All right, have a wonderful day.
Just a few more housekeeping items before we adjourn. I will not be here presumably next month, just going to say that. So Vice Chair Gardner will be running the meeting. I've given him full reign on topics and whatnot. So